Well, we've had a pretty good amount of races since we last spoke, so let's catch up about all of them. The titles of these podcasts, now that I've established a format of combining all of the race locations into one name, are becoming more and more ridiculous the longer I leave it before recording podcasts. So, certainly going to get interesting by the end of the season when I've got to combine about 16 different races into a sort of supercalifragilisticexpialidocious type word that not even people in F1 will understand, let alone people that might just happen to see this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and go, yeah, I don't know what that means. I don't think I'll listen to that. And I can't blame any of them, to be honest with you. Coming at you from a slightly different location today. Not from the bedroom of my parents' house in Oxfordshire, but the top of White Horse Hill in Oxfordshire. I've got a lovely view of all of the countryside, some wind turbines. I've actually, just before I started recording, I've spilt a bottle of water all over me. So unfortunately, the podcast is going to go ahead, but it's going to be delayed. The analysis will begin behind the safety microphone on extreme wet wires in about an hour's time. So while we wait, while I fill that time, I will continue to spill water on myself in the hope that it miraculously gets dry. It's a bit too long ago now for anybody to recognise that's a Monaco joke. Thank you for holding. You're listening to the podcast is important to us, but safety is key. This podcast will only commence in completely dry conditions. Please hold. Not really. Welcome to the F1MoreThing podcast, a podcast for all conditions. It'll be consistently average throughout any situation you can throw at it, and consistently average will be the two words that go on his gravestone. It's Joe Pilbrow. Hello and welcome to the F1MoreThing podcast. Today, coming from the top of White Horse Hill, in my car, like a recently divorced dad contemplating his life's failures. Don't have many excuses for having missed as many races, but there's always a way to spin it in podcasting. We're just going to do a 6-race spectacular, which means a long and laborious process of reminding ourselves what happened over the last 6 races. We have had, since we last spoke, Spain, Monaco, Azerbaijan, Canada, Britain and Austria, all of which have been very interesting races, as 2022's year is shaping up to be a very interesting one in history. We're very lucky to live through it. So I'd say, let's get on with it. I'm absolutely roasting my arse off during the British heatwave in a car that has recently had its aircon done, but I don't want to turn it on, 1, to waste fuel, and 2, because I want the audio quality to be tip-top. It's a completely selfless endeavour, this podcasting business, and I won't hear anything otherwise. Got a lovely view of the Oxfordshire Hills, so let's talk about Spain. It is a race that Red Bull did an incredibly good job at, with Perez being very, very quick all weekend and Verstappen eventually winning the race. And to start with, they're on very, very equal terms, Ferrari and Red Bull. I think both Leclerc and George Russell had done some pretty good research on the start. You know how all the drivers watch various onboards from the start of last year? Well, Leclerc did an amazing job, because what Hamilton didn't do last year when he started on the front row with Verstappen, he didn't cover the inside, so Verstappen just shoved it up the inside, like Verstappen does, and he lost the position, and eventually he lost the race. Leclerc pointed his car over to Verstappen's side of the grid and immediately moved over to that side. Verstappen couldn't do anything about it, and Leclerc kept the position. It's a good start. And I think Leclerc is benefiting through many occasions this year of having watched Verstappen battle Hamilton last year and just doing the opposite to what Hamilton did when Hamilton lost out on certain occasions and repeating what Hamilton did when Hamilton won out on certain occasions. I think it's going to serve him well if his bloody car can keep up. Spain was also the first race that we've seen where the ultimate battle of the ages showed its head, and that is, of course, the battle between Haas and Lewis Hamilton. Multiple races this year. Lewis, contrary to what we would have ever believed last year, is battling Haas, and it's a one-man team, just Hamilton versus Haas. He seems to have had many occasions where he's come together with them, or he's simply battling them, or he can't get past them. So Spain was the first time that we've seen that Hamilton had contact with Magnussen in turn 4. This has put Kevin in the gravel and pretty much ended his race. Hamilton, on many occasions throughout his career, has had contact with people and just gotten away with the most minimal damage you can get. So that's lucky. But the thing that surprised everybody, I think, was how quickly he gave up. He had a bit of damage. Yeah, he was at the back now, and, his race didn't look very good. But most of the time you can salvage a race, especially when you're in a car that they thought was at least third fastest, if not challenging second and first. But he gave up surprisingly quickly, bearing in mind how much he likes to be known for sort of carrying on through adversity, So it was a good lesson to kids everywhere, I think. Make sure to battle stewards, drivers, have intense rivalry throughout your career, battle racism and discrimination with immense stoicism. But if you get damage on lap 1, leave it until at least lap 2 before saying you can't be arsed and you should save the engine. And it's moments like that that your team steps in and saves you points that could do you very well in the Ultimate Championship. Because, he did pretty well to battle through to a good point scoring position after that. So it was worth his team saying, no, actually, #blessed, get off your arse, let's get back into the race. And overall, I think the incident, Hamilton was unlucky. There was a bit of understeer for him in that corner. But overall, I think it's a racing incident, but Kevin was a little bit more to blame. I think Kevin saying Hamilton shoved him off on purpose is a bit of in-the-moment extremism. Not a word. I've always used that word, but I don't think it is one. I think my English teacher had a go at me for using it once. Kevin just seemed to turn in a lot more into that corner than he needed to. There was a lot more space on the outside that he could have made use of, and I don't think either of them needed to have that contact, really. It was also, as well as the start of the Hamilton-Haas battle, it was also the start of the gravel epidemic. Well, not the start for Carlos, I suppose, the continuation. He's ended up in the gravel for the third time in 4 races, just completely out of the blue and on his own. Nobody punted him off. There wasn't a car failure. We think it was the wind because Verstappen did exactly the same thing a couple laps later. And I'm still sort of trying to work out, even as we're up to date with races now, whether these cars are more wind sensitive than the previous generation. From an engineer's perspective and an aerodynamicist's perspective, I can see reasons as to why both cars, you might argue, 2020s and 2021 cars were more aero-affected on the top of the cars, so to speak. And, that's why they're more affected by dirty air. But then these cars are so reliant on their downforce coming from underneath the cars that the slightest bit of wind affecting those tunnels underneath could throw the car off course. So I could see it either way. I'd need to speak to an actual aerodynamicist or expert to know the answers to that question. And it's something that Ricciardo has been leaning on and as an excuse in some races. Ricciardo's been unfortunately having to wheel out all the excuses as to why he hasn't been able to match Lando or get, half-decent performances in the McLaren. And wind has been one of them. He says it's been windy. I don't know if that cuts it, Daniel, to be honest, mate. I don't know how many legitimate excuses you've got anymore, unfortunately. I wish you had some. I want to talk about Daniel a bit more later on, but I think it's not looking great, and I don't think his result in Austria is helping him too much. I think people are very quick to jump on, he's had a good race, this must be it from now, he must be great from here on in, but I'm not so sure about that. George Russell in Spain, one of the moves of the season with Verstappen. Obviously a much, much quicker car, but Mercedes from Spain onwards have seemed like they're at least back in contention for fighting for podiums a lot more often and for wins. And George Russell seemed like he could have won that race at various points. He was in the lead, and sure, Verstappen and the Ferraris had ultimate pace, but George seemed to be able to hold Verstappen off for a while, and Verstappen going up the inside of him, but George just hanging it around the outside of turn 1 and 2, and then pushing him wide round the outside, Max having to go off the track. And I loved the press conference after, where Verstappen's sort of asked about that move and whether he thought it was acceptable that George pushed him off the track. And Max sort of defends George, saying, oh, well, it's hard for drivers to see you there. You're not really in the mirror, but you're not really in the vision of the driver. And so he sort of says, oh, I'm not sure George saw me there, so, you can't really have a go at him for it. And it just cuts to George smiling to himself with a face that says, yeah, I knew exactly what I was doing, so don't make me out to be all innocent, mate. I pushed you off for a reason, because it was beneficial to my cause. I knew exactly where you were. I liked that. I think a lot of people underestimate George as a sort of a very media-savvy, nice guy, but as they all are, in a helmet with a car that can battle, they're just as ruthless as anyone else. And I think, as well as one of the moves of the season, we've got one of the ultimate commentator's curse examples from Spain as well. Martin and Crofty going from commentating on everybody during that race and Charles not being in the picture at all, to him saying, oh, look, Charles must wonder where everyone's got to this race. He's just got such a dominant advantage over everybody else. And that's the point where they cut to the Ferrari, and it's going slowly, and it's Charles with an engine problem. The timing has never been better. It's an incredibly cruel thing to watch as a Ferrari fan, and it's happened far too many times, not only in the races before Spain, but also the races that I'm going to talk about very soon in our 6-race bonanza that we're still doing. If you're a Ferrari fan, the pain is endless and ongoing, unfortunately, but yeah, George was fighting for the lead, technically, in that race, and it wasn't likely he was going to get it, but it was great to see him fighting and to have an introduction to what George is going to look like when he's finally got a decent enough car to fight consistently with people like Leclerc and Verstappen, because, we've had a whole year of Hamilton and Verstappen, but very rarely have we seen, in fact, I don't think we had ever seen Verstappen and Russell going at it in almost equal machinery, with George being in a Williams and Verstappen being up the front for most of his time. It was incredibly unlikely that we had, and we saw George take it to Verstappen. So it's nice to have an unknown quantity suddenly join the fight. It's almost as great as to see this race's whole second of Stroll doing something stupid. We get one every race. It's a nice little tradition that we've got now. This time he's getting clipped by Gasly in turn 1, spinning round, ruining what was already a shit race, turning it into a shitter one. Goodbye, Stroll. See you next race. That's how it goes for him and Latifi now. It's a real unfortunate event and tradition for Canada, I think, as a whole. But unfortunately, it's what we've got. And I think, unfortunately, as a sort of trend of what Gasly's been doing the last few races, I get the impression Gasly might be joining that trio soon. I think he was sort of let off the hook quite a few times last year for first lap incidents, and it became a slight running joke that nobody kind of picked up on that often, of sort of front wing damage that he would get often. He's not only been involved in quite a few first lap incidents with front wings and a lot more in recent times, but he's also been having a few more just mid-race and end-race incidents that didn't need to happen, that I think he could be blamed for. Elsewhere, great recovery drive from Lewis to get back into the points after the damage, but I think he was just overshadowed by Russell in that race, and Valtteri Bottas getting 6th, doing what I thought he was going to do in a lot more races this year, was to be best of the rest. But it's been a lot tighter with Alpine and with Haas, which is good, but we wanted to see Valtteri, as it seemed he was going to do at a lot of the races this year, mixing it up at the front a little bit more. It would have been nice to see Perez and Verstappen fight, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a shame that a team order like that has come. And I think the excuses were real and true in the sense that, Verstappen's strategy was faster, but you do have to question why your supposedly number one driver and defending champion accidentally ended up on the best strategy. Something to think about. Especially when Perez seemed on it all weekend. Like, he seemed pretty quick and like he had an advantage, like he has in a few more races this year than last year over Verstappen. He just seemed to have an edge, and then when it came to the race, just not the strategic advantage. Lando Norris, obviously in a car that hasn't been great this year, has not been providing him with consistent points, as with Daniel, and for a few races has been feeling like absolute dog's arse for the entire race. And even then has been able to pull out some immense performances. You know, with an illness, I can barely ask to drive to the shops when I've got hay fever, let alone drive a Grand Prix with tonsillitis. So fair play to him to perform not only with illness but under immense heat. I mean, it's something all F1 drivers are used to. But what I'm realising is I'm really not... I think the main thing, other than lack of talent and lack of experience, obviously, that would stop me from being a Formula 1 driver is I need to be cool at all times to perform in any mental capacity. I mean, even now, I'm sat in my car without the aircon on, roasting, and I can feel my brain slowly shutting down to a point of genuine distress and anger. So I feel as soon as I'm put in a race suit, without even a car around me with no aircon, I would immediately shut down, become completely angry and useless, and make terrible decisions. So I'm always amazed at the amount of composure that F1 drivers can show. And talking of McLaren and talking of Lando, I suppose we should come on to Daniel. There's been a lot of rumours circulating around recently. Some of them started by McLaren themselves and by Zak Brown, you know, saying how his performance hasn't been good enough. I'm not surprised that he said that, but I am surprised that he wouldn't expect a backlash or some sort of, you know, the media to jump on that. As soon as you make any sort of statement like the performance hasn't been good enough, the first thing newspapers and media organisations are going to do is immediately jump on that and say, well, Daniel's not going to be in the car next year if his performances aren't good enough, even by the standard of Zak Brown. So I'm surprised that he made that comment, because Zak Brown's always been someone that seems to have been quite media savvy, and you know, him and Andreas have always stuck by him, and that's always seemed to have been quite a good strategy. But, you know, it reaches a point where if your performances are that shite, on the whole, people get bored of it. You know, I'm getting quite bored of McLaren only ever really having one car in the points. And, you know, it's just, you have to put the misery to some end at some point, don't you? You know, I'm happy to see Seb's got a few better performances in recent races, and he's showing that he's outperforming the car, because he's gone through it, you know, at Ferrari and at Aston in the same way that I think Daniel has. But to be honest, I don't see Daniel getting a hold of this car. There's just been too many races now where you go, oh, he might get it this time, and he doesn't. And part of me starting to think it isn't the car. It seems like something someone that doesn't know about Formula 1 would say, maybe, that, well, clearly he's just not very good, you know, like, but we've seen Daniel perform brilliantly before. I just start to think that it's been too long now, and I think with the pressure that McLaren have, you know, there's not many teams that can say they have as strong a talent pool as McLaren. They've got IndyCar drivers, they've got Oscar Piastri maybe that they can put in there as a deal with Alpine. I don't want to see Daniel go, but when you've got O'Ward and Herta and Piastri, and maybe, you know, even Gasly's been thrown into the mix, even though I think Gasly's performances haven't been good enough to justify that. You've just got so many people vying for that position that I think Daniel is keeping that position based on his character and how much everybody likes him outside of the car now, and his past race wins, rather than current performance. And I think there's not many people that actually get judged as much on their current performance, or on their past rather, as Daniel has. You know, everybody says that Formula 1 is a ruthless, cutthroat business where it doesn't matter how good you've been in the past, you're judged on your last race kind of thing. But it seems that a lot more people are given credit for their past at the moment, which is fair. in many instances. I really like Daniel. I don't want to see him go, but I don't like seeing McLaren wallow either. Some people were rumouring that he'd be out of McLaren by the end of the year and he might go to Aston or somewhere. It seems that Seb is pretty much done, man. I don't see Seb having much. If he stays next year, I think that will be his last year. Even if he does that, I think I'd be surprised. So maybe he'd go to Aston, but I don't see Daniel being that happy to go to what he sees as a team not at least challenging for points. You know, McLaren have at least got the car to do something occasionally, so he's there. And so do Aston, I suppose, but less reliably, I think. Obviously, McLaren and Daniel are saying that he's definitely going to be around next year, which is good, but it is a bit like, you know, they've put such a definitive time limit on he'll be around for 2023 that you sort of go, oh, right, so he's not going to be around after that then. And, you know, Colton Herta testing out last year's car doesn't look great for Daniel. And I want to see him stick around, but I'm unsure whether he deserves to. That's the last I'm going to say about it. I don't want to perpetuate the rumours too hard, you know. With the reach of this podcast being at least 7 people, you don't want to perpetuate rumours too hard and create a media storm. So let's move on to Monaco. So as I alluded to at the start, Monaco was a sort of wait around and see if there's actually going to be a race type race. Sort of reminded me of Spa last year, because it seemed that one of the ways that we were going to try and go racing was by not going racing and waiting for the rain that was never going to stop or forecast to stop. So some of those early calls on red flags were a bit cautious, but I can get it. I can understand that. It seemed like we were only going to red flag the session anyway, because it did start absolutely tipping it down. And some of the stewarding was slightly odd for some of the race, and it distracted us from the fact that the TV direction actually wasn't catastrophically terrible. It was only awful in some places, and that is a vast improvement from the year before. So maybe that was some sort of conspiratorial master plan they'd come up with, but I'm impressed at how, well, I don't know if it's how agile these cars seemed in qualifying, bearing in mind how big and heavy they are, or just how much, you know, the drivers had sort of muscled them around the track. But there was a great qualifying for Seb. Seb did an amazing job, showed his experience in what is obviously a terrible car. It's a shame for Bottas, because the hype was absolutely real that he could be top 5 for quite a while. The lap from Leclerc was unbelievable. George Russell, good qualifying to keep him in that top 5 in every race hunt. Horrendous crash from Mick, and the start, I think, of people starting to properly doubt him. You know, he hadn't maybe lived up to the name in his opening season. He hadn't really had the chance to with the car and the teammate, although he did absolutely boss Mazepin, so that's one down, but people weren't too impressed with that, bearing in mind how shit Mazepin was. But people genuinely started to doubt whether he deserved a seat in F1 after that, because he'd just had a few too many instances of either crashing or making mistakes, etc. Fortunately, he has since rectified himself, and he has energised those Schumacher genes. I'm going to come on to that a little bit later on. But it was pretty much, rather than the streets of Monaco, it was just save city all weekend, wasn't it? Sainz, unbelievable save on the main straight. Vettel with an unbelievable save. Zhou with an unbelievable save. Just people nearly losing it, and as Zhou said, he was going to need some new pants. But yeah, some great driving. I don't know if that shows how difficult it is to drive Monaco, or how agile the cars, or at least how quick the reactions of the drivers are. It's obviously a mixture of all three. I still haven't actually seen the onboard from Sainz, really, in qualifying, as to see how he managed to miss the yellow for Perez. It looked like he was far enough back that he would have had time to see it, but I haven't really seen how obvious the yellow flag was, because it's a very weird incident to have sort of 3 cars turn up at the corner and 2 of them pointing the wrong direction. But he wasn't that far behind Perez on the track, so it might be understandable. Some great overtakes from Gasly. I've said his performances haven't been up to scratch, but Monaco, he did really good. He picked a good time to put the intermediates on early, and it took a couple laps to get him warmed up, but after a while he just started picking people off, and no, it paid off. It was a good call. another race where it showed that it doesn't really matter how perfect Leclerc is. His own team will happily don the red noses and the face paint and multicoloured wigs to absolutely fuck his home race up for him. So that was nice. Cheers to his team. And another example of, I think, Ferrari just being at the sharp end of the grid but not having the sharp end strategy-wise. And that's going to come back to haunt them championship-wise, I think, as well. I think it's actually very impressive to put a driver from a comfortable first to fourth in Monaco. We've seen people lose a pit stop and go from first to second and be annoyed. You know, Daniel Ricciardo, Hamilton, Verstappen. But to go from first to fourth and to have also done a similar thing in losing out to the equal comparative driver with Sainz as well, it's almost commendable in how much of a fuck up that is. But also, I don't remember the last time we had four cars as close to each other as Monaco. You know, nose to tail for lap after lap after lap. You know, the closest I can think is sort of Hamilton chasing down a Red Bull and, you know, obviously Mansell and Senna. But even then, that's just two cars fighting it out. I would struggle to think of an example in history where we've had four cars go at it like that. Another tick on the tally list that I'm scraping into my wall of reasons why the 22 cars are working well for us so far. It was also the start of, and a continuation, I think, of Hamilton versus the world, or Hamilton versus an entire other team. He's had Haas in Spain to deal with, and he has also had the Alpines in Monaco to deal with Ocon colliding with him twice, I think it was. I think the first one, Ocon turned in, but he was sort of ahead, so it kind of made sense, even though Hamilton had half his car up the inside. He hadn't really completed that move, so maybe that's not entirely Ocon's fault. I think the second one was Ocon's fault, but it didn't really matter because whatever happened, he was going to be behind an Alpine. Alonso, halfway round the track on the other side of the circuit to the main leading cars, had just decided he was going to save his tyres and keep every single other car behind him. So Hamilton was getting completely riled up. It's both entertaining and frustrating because you sort of want to see them battle, but Alonso just had the measure of the defensive moves, and around a track like Monaco, you've just got absolutely no chance. So I think overall, the race, as Martin said in commentary, had everything really. Like, it had red flags, it had big crashes, it had really tense battles, it had strategic things, pit stop, overtakes, people putting on tyres at the right times to pull off moves. And in a year where we were unsure whether Monaco was going to continue into the future, I think it was a really good demonstration of why Monaco deserves to be on the calendar. Yes, it's not overtake city, and sometimes you need to rely on some adverse weather conditions for it to be an interesting race, but the drivers really like it, not only for the history of that race, but because, you know, you grow up watching that race and wanting to race on those streets, but also because it's a different challenge. You know, it's not just can you overtake everybody, it's can you concentrate that hard for that amount of time in a track and a circuit surrounded by walls and that doesn't leave you any possible chance of an error. And we see lots of drivers not be able to cope with that on circuits where you've got lots of runoff and gravel and things like that. But Monaco doesn't give you those chances, and I think the really top-level drivers really enjoy the chance to show off why they're a top-level driver. You know, Leclerc and Verstappen and, well, Sainz and Perez, I suppose, now have to be in that because Sainz has been on the podium for the last 2 years in second place, and Perez has now won it, so they'd have to be considered pretty much up there for really good Monaco drivers, as well as Norris, I think. He's done really good the last couple of years. Hamilton's never had a great performance there. You know, he's never had an outstanding Monaco performance, and I think a few people think that he doesn't really like the circuit that much. But the drivers like the technical challenge. It is a completely different technical challenge to lots of other tracks. And I think even if it doesn't provide an interesting race, it's a very interesting concept and a very interesting challenge for the drivers, and it's only once a year. You know, if that was what all the races were like every year, with the chance of them being boring, then I'd consider the change, but it's got too much history and is too much of a mental challenge for the drivers to get rid of, is my personal opinion. So, keep Monaco is the overall lesson of today. Let's move on to Azerbaijan, another street circuit, but with completely different challenges for the drivers. A circuit that doesn't leave much room for error, but has much more chance of lunges and overtaking positions, and leaves much more opportunity for straight line speed to come into fruition and for teams to make hay while the sun shines when they've got a car that can outpace every single other car on the straights. Red Bull. But turn one, first lap, first corner, was almost a carbon copy of what Perez and Hamilton did on that restart once Verstappen had crashed last year. Perez this time was in P2 and he was P1 last year. And instead of Perez going round the outside while Hamilton locked up and went straight on, this year it was him up the inside while Leclerc had a lock up. He didn't go straight on as bad as Hamilton did last year, but Perez nailed the first corner again, nailed the restart, up into the lead. And he seemed to have the measure on Verstappen all weekend as well. Another example of Perez seeming to, in every session, have the measure. But later on, Verstappen had the race pace and Perez could not keep up. And to be honest, I'm struggling to understand how that happens. You know, how you can go from dominating every practice session and from out-qualifying Verstappen to then having almost no race pace and finishing an unbelievable amount of seconds off of Verstappen. And, you know, even Perez in the car was like, yeah, I didn't have the pace today. That was it. I was done. Verstappen wins. And it's a strange technical, maybe setup problem they've got. But it's another thing that someone much more intelligent and in the know than I will have to figure out. Seb Vettel with one of the best 180s in F1 history. I mean, to pull it off is one thing, but to have thought about doing it that quickly is unbelievable, and to have been millimetres from smashing his rear wing into the wall, absolutely brilliant stuff, and something that I would probably attempt to replicate on the old F1 game, which is how I judge myself to be an F1 driver all the time. And I would fail every single time, I would imagine. I might have to have a go at that later just to see whether it's even possible. But to pull it off in a place where the majority of all the other drivers have just accepted defeat and sort of very painfully, slowly and cowardly reversed back onto the track, trying to find the gear, then trying to find first and doing a 3-point turn just to go, nope, spin, done, nice. And it was an almost equally as good commentator's curse example, because I think Webber was just talking about how good Vettel was at 90-degree corners and how he could never keep up with him, and that was one of his specialties. And as he was saying it, he overshot the corner trying to overtake Ocon and went straight on and had to spin it round. So it's a almost identical and brilliantly timed commentator's curse example of Vettel as it was with Leclerc and his engine failure in Spain. And talking of engine failures for Ferrari, it's becoming a running theme, and I think it's probably going to be something that this championship is decided on, is how many engine failures you've had, or how many DNFs and brake-by-wire problems and just general power unit and car reliability things have gone wrong for you. Ferrari wrecked hearts with Leclerc's engine problem, and it makes me think that Ferrari have done the thing that Alpine said they were going to do at the start of the year. Do you remember that they said with developing the new power unit for this year, they were going to go for full-on performance and speed rather than reliability, and sort of figure out the reliability later? And it's something we saw with Alonso especially, and Ocon as well, of reliability problems at the start of the year. They seem to have got on top of that a bit more now, so they've executed that plan quite well. It is a very strong power unit, plus it's now pretty reliable. I say that, Ocon's just recently had a problem, but other than that, Ferrari, I don't think have said they were going to do that, although it's sort of a historic thing with Ferrari that, as it was a thing that Enzo said about a team doesn't really need to focus on aerodynamics if you've got a powerful enough engine or something like that. That's a real hash of the quote, but so it's a historic thing that Ferrari engines are supposed to be horsepower laden, but it seems that they might have gone too far down that route to be reliable, and it's not, unfortunately, going to end in Azerbaijan, the Ferrari power unit problems, as we'll come on to later. But it doesn't seem to me as if they needed to have gone so much down a performance route, or that they're gaining so much on performance now that they make up for it in engine power, and that the reliability doesn't matter. If they were gaining so much, I mean, Red Bull's on the straights is so much faster. I think that's mainly down to their lack of drag, but it's also down to the power unit being pretty good. But it's also fairly reliable, even though they've had their fair share of reliability problems too. But it doesn't seem to me that Ferrari needed to have gone down such an unreliable route when they have such a strong car. If they just pulled back a little bit on reliability and gone a little bit more conservative on power, maybe they'd be doing even better, and maybe they'd be leading the championship right now. Maybe an engineer would tell me that that is very much oversimplifying the conundrum that they face, and I'm not going to speak to any engineers for that exact reason. We move on to Canada, and Alonso absolutely nailing qualifying. Seeing him back on the front row was an incredibly smile-inducing moment, I think. And the potential of a Verstappen-Alonso first corner was great. I built it up in my head more than it delivered, but that's what we like to do before all races. Just to imagine how all of the drivers that you think are the most feisty and the best on the first lap are going to come together. I was building up pictures of Verstappen getting Verstappened by Alonso, and Alonso talks a good game, but overall he didn't have the pace to keep up, and finishing 6th or 7th I think he did in the end. This was a real shame. And but those moments before a race where you have all of those imagined scenarios, they're sometimes the best part. So we like to live in a fantasy for a while. Talking of qualifying, I think Russell going for those slicks on a wet track was, sure, retrospectively stupid. It didn't work out for him, and is something that the Formula One drivers in commentary teams, both on Channel 4 and on Sky, were saying, that's not going to work. It's too wet. And obviously they've got more views and more vision and maybe more of an overall viewpoint, and maybe it's easy to say from the commentary box, but they seem to be able to know in advance that wasn't going to work. But I'll be honest with you, it's the kind of thing I really like about George and Lando as well, because, well, Lando especially in last year, he did that in Spa, and equally it worked out as awfully as it did, well, even more awfully actually than for George. Lando coming off first corner in Eau Rouge, a horrible crash, a crash that we think every single time someone goes off there is going to be catastrophic, to say the least. Fortunately it wasn't, but that too was a gamble on slick tyres that they couldn't get working, and it's not worked out for George in Canada either. But I like the fact that they've got enough confidence in themselves and enough confidence in the car, but at the same time you can say that it's not really confidence, because, or at least it's overconfidence if it doesn't actually work and you just crash at the first corner. And that's an example of George being out-qualified by Lewis, not necessarily because Lewis was faster, but because he made a decision that eventually decided the outcome. And maybe that's why Lewis is a 7-time world champion, because he is able to make the right decisions on tyres at the right time and in qualifying and that kind of thing. But, we've seen people make the wrong decisions, what seems like the wrong decisions, and it turns out that they switch him on and it works. George did a similar thing when Lando crashed, but he was qualifying P2 in a Williams and just did an absolutely amazing lap and was just on the right tyres at the right time to do it. So it's worked for him in the past, just not then. Let's see about the future. Red Bull and Ferrari pretty much going back-to-back on engine failures now. Perez engine failure this time, and the championship is going to be decided on these. I think it'll be an interesting tally to look back on when it comes to the end of the year and we know who's won this championship and who's won the Constructors, as to how many engine failures may or may not have decided this outcome and what would have happened had those engine failures not taken place. And on the topic of engine failures, just as soon as it seemed that Mick was going to get into the points, his car fails him. And it seemed that not only was he on the pace that weekend, but he was going to sort of redeem himself from the crash that he's had and the not good luck and not great performances that he's had in recent times just up until that point. And as his engineer said, you were on it, and sometimes luck doesn't fall your way. But our hero will eventually redeem himself in forthcoming races. That's a spoiler to races you will have already watched and are weeks old already. And it's hard not to think during this race that when watching Sainz try to catch up to Verstappen, that if he had that extra tenth or two that Leclerc seems to have, he would have won that race. You know, Verstappen was able to just hold him off at various points and extend the gap where it needed to be, but he didn't have the ultimate pace just to pull away. And obviously there was a tyre advantage as well for Sainz, but there was moves that Leclerc did during that race, like the up the inside dive bomb of Ocon, that was sort of a 50-50 and came out of nowhere and was just a great move, and he'd obviously been working up to that brilliantly through the last couple of laps. And Leclerc didn't come through the field in the same way that everyone thought he would, but at the same time he made up places and was doing good overtakes, and you get the impression that Sainz in that race just didn't have that extra tenth or two that he needed to actually pass. Obviously the straight line speed of the Red Bull does not help, but in the UK, Sainz has put his foot down a bit more, both speed-wise and temperament with his team-wise, which has been long awaited, and we like that. And a crazy crash from Yuki coming out of the pits. Almost seemed to sort of forget that he had to turn right at any point and just floored it. Completely messed up his prediction of when he should brake and turn and all of that sort of things. It reminded me of a couple of things. The first being, when you're just driving along on the road and you've got your sat-nav open and you turn to look at your sat-nav just to check that the next turn you've got to make is coming up soon or that you're about to turn down the correct road, and then all of a sudden you look back up and you're already at the turn that you've got to make, so you've just got to brake ridiculously hard and try and turn at the same time, and the people behind you are rightfully pissed off. It reminded me of that. He was looking down at the sat-nav. It would be a great addition to a Formula 1 steering wheel, just to have a sat-nav maybe. Hey Siri, get directions to the nearest McDonald's halfway through a race. That kind of thing. But it also reminded me of when I think it might just be a thing on the new F1 game, as all my references are. You can now decide to have, I think it was a setting in the previous games, I just didn't realise it. But I've now turned off the setting that keeps your tyres at a reasonable temperature when you come out of the pits. So now my tyres are absolutely freezing, and it takes a whole lap of actually warming them up, like in real life. And it's quite a nice experience once you get used to it. But it's a completely humbling experience the first time you try it, because you're all over the place, oversteer, understeer, you have absolutely no grip. And I feel like that's sort of what Yuki did. He just forgot that those tyres are not going to be at the temperature you need them to be on that first corner and just straight out. On the other hand, I think that Yuki is the kind of driver to need to make those big mistakes to eventually not do them ever again. And I think all drivers are like that to a certain degree, but Yuki does seem to learn. There have been a few mistakes that he's made about, overshooting in qualifying and just trying to push too hard unnecessarily. And he hasn't really done that recently. He's had a fairly consistent performance. And, with Gasly not performing as well, it's sort of leveled those two out in a sense. And Yuki looks a bit better for it, even though he's made a couple of stupid mistakes. And Pierre doesn't look as good for it. But talking of the teams beginning with A, we thought would be in midfield, maybe best of the rest position come the end of the year. Alpine, in this race in Canada, I think pretty much confirmed that they are the best of the rest team. McLaren, who you'd have thought at the start of the season, bearing in mind how much they'd improved the previous couple of years, should have been in that position, but Alpine are way more consistent, even though they've had more engine problems and more reliability problems than lots of the other midfield teams. They just seem to have been a more consistent team and able to get those 6th, 7th, 8th positions a lot more often. And it makes me think, talking of Daniel Ricciardo's uncertainty at McLaren, how much he is the ultimate example of a driver that has failed to pick the right time to go to each team. You know, it's the great comparison between him and Carlos Sainz of Carlos has just seemed to be able to go to the right team at the right time for them to be on the up and for not only him to look good, but for him to further a team and to get podiums and more point-scoring positions out of it. He went from Toro Rosso, managed to escape the sort of Red Bull family that obviously hasn't worked out for people like Gasly and Albon, and moved to Renault as they were on the up, then moved to McLaren as they were on the up, and then moved to Ferrari as they've become championship contenders. Everything's worked out perfectly for his career. Ricciardo's sort of done similar moves to similar teams, just at the time when they're, not by necessarily any fault of his own, on the down. Went to Renault, and it took him a while to get used to the car. He eventually did, but then didn't think that they were as good as McLaren, and then an opportunity turned up at McLaren, so he went there, and then he couldn't get used to the car, even though Lando was performing, and then this year, he doesn't seem to be able to even perform this year, even though he should be used to the car, and it doesn't suit his driving style, and all that sort of stuff. He's just made the wrong decisions at the wrong time. But if he had stayed at Alpine, can you think how much he'd have been used to that 2021 car last year? You know, I don't think it would have been him alongside Alonso, because I think you've got two obviously number one drivers there, or supposedly obvious, but what a team that would have been, and he would have been used to all the systems in the car, and he wouldn't have had the excuse of having to get used to another car. And now that Alpine, with these new regulations, seem to have the upper hand and are the most consistent midfield team, you'd have to say Daniel would be in a much better place right now. So it's a real shame. That's just how the cookie crumbles, and we have to take solace from the fact that in a parallel universe somewhere, Daniel Ricciardo has maybe started on the front row alongside Verstappen in an Alpine. We can't see it, not in this universe, but in a parallel universe somewhere, there is that lovely image, and maybe Daniel Ricciardo's won a race for Alpine. There's a whole podcast to be had on the possible parallel universes of Formula One, isn't there? I'll maybe consider that. I mean, I can't even do one on time at the moment, let alone two. And finally, for Canada, before we move on, I know that I slant Lance Stroll a lot, but credit where credit is due. I have to be fair when the guy does a half-decent job. And the car isn't great for him at the moment, so it doesn't lend itself to good performances. In Canada, he had an under-the-radar performance. Instead of it being under the radar because it was shit, like normal, it was under the radar because it was half-decent. He got 10th. He got a point. And fair play. Not a good car, getting a point. If it was Seb Vettel, I would probably have already talked about it and said, isn't Seb great? So what I'm going to do is, on very few occasions, Lance is a very good driver. Unfortunately, those examples and those situations do not arise often enough. Anyway, well done, Lance. Moving on to Britain, or the UK, or Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, or Silverstone, or the British Grand Prix. How many names do we fucking need? And to be honest, it was something we can all agree on as F1 fans around the world, that we've just seen one of the best British Grand Prix in years, maybe ever. And it's quite a surprising thing to be able to say, actually, because the British Grand Prix has delivered many important moments in a championship, eventful circumstances, both in tyre failures. We've seen a lot, especially in the Pirelli era. We've seen Hamilton finish and win a race with 3 wheels. We've seen Verstappen and Hamilton come together in what was one of the most eventful circumstances in a championship in decades at Copse. And to say that this was one of the most entertaining and one of the most eventful races is an incredible accolade to be able to give the British Grand Prix, and it's a sense of pride as a British person to be able to say that we hosted one of the best races, and was a race where we had so many different cars fighting for position almost equally. Apart from the race being really good, it was also eventful for bad reasons, and that's the Zhou crash. I don't remember seeing a crash like that, you know? There's been crashes like Alonso's crash a while ago in Australia that was a bit like that, but you very rarely see a car flip upside down like that. You like to think they've got such a centre of gravity that they don't flip upside down, but a pincer movement like that is certainly going to do it, and it sort of happened in Austria as well, but not to such horrible endings, let's say. Very happy that Zhou was able to walk away from that. It's a very scary thing, and one of those things that you never really get used to as a fan of Formula One, of the amount of time that the TV director does not cut to footage of the driver. You know, we see George Russell very valiantly and commendably running over to Zhou to help out and to point the marshals in the right direction and to just be a very nice guy. But you never know what the ending of one of those crashes is going to be, but very grateful that Zhou was able to walk away from it. And thank God for catch fencing as well. I mean, thank God for the halo, but thank God for catch fencing. The shots on iPhones and probably other smartphones from people that were stood in that grandstand where he flipped over the fence and any higher into the crowd were pretty frightening. Thank God for that fence, and thank God he was able to walk away and nobody was injured. We don't like to see crashes like that. And unfortunately, I'm going to go back to slating. I said slanting earlier, didn't I? Rather than slating. I'm going to correct myself about 10 minutes too late. I said slant, instead of slate. I'm a moron. Sorry. I'm going to have to go back to slating Gasly a bit. I think the move he tried to do up the inside of Zhou and Russell was sort of never on. I think you can sort of predict that George was going to move over to the left to take the corner, and unfortunately, I'm pretty sure Gasly did a very similar thing in Austria. There was a sort of 3-car pincer movement that put people out of the race, not as horrifically as in the UK, but Gasly being involved in both of those kind of reinforces the first lap front wing Gasly incident prone, becoming a bit of a Stroll Latifi character type thing. I don't want to jump on that too quickly, but I think often Gasly gets more praise than he deserves. It's kind of a harsh thing to say, but he's not going to listen to this, so it almost doesn't matter. George Russell being very nice and sportsmanlike was good to see. It was a very sort of Senna-esque running out of his car to help another driver type situation. And I think they would have allowed him to restart had his car restarted and he driven away. You know, it wasn't like, oh, you've gotten out of your car to help someone, fuck you. But yeah, by the time he'd come back to his car, even though he'd told the marshals not to put it on a flatbed, they had put it on a flatbed. But I don't think it mattered, judging from his and Toto's words afterwards. I think he tried to restart the car and couldn't anyway, so I think you'd much rather have gotten out of the car but not been able to restart than stayed in your car and found out that Zhou wasn't okay, you know? So he made the right call. I was very impressed at how Verstappen and Leclerc both seemed to be able to just drive around the damage. You know, it's something we've seen Verstappen do on various occasions in Hungary and things like that and still getting the points. Leclerc was able to match Sainz on various occasions and seemed even faster than him, and they even let him pass at some points, even though he had 5 points of downforce missing. That's ridiculous, and Sainz didn't seem to have the pace for a lot of that race until he had the tyre advantage and he just said fuck you to the team basically and went, I'm winning this race, this is mine, see you later, and flew off into the distance. But I mean, Leclerc's move up the inside after that restart was just a bit ambitious, I think. Going up the inside of almost 2, maybe 3 cars is certainly wishful thinking. Would have been awesome if it had come off, but very rarely does it. And him and Perez both had the same idea and ended up just having contact. So, yeah, not brilliant. And it ruined his whole race, essentially, by that dive bomb, because it's another example of how when eventually he's in the lead, being the lead car actually was a disadvantage. And Ferrari messing up Leclerc's strategy, retrospectively it seems as if they had the amount of time they needed to be able to pit both the cars, stack them, get them both on fresh tyres, and then make both of the end of their races very easy. But they only pit Sainz, leaving Leclerc out on hard tyres that he'd already been using for ages anyway, for the rest of the race, and he was just going to drop back every single time he had a car behind him. He was going to drop back, and that was sort of predictable. We've seen it before where Perez, I think in Spain, was on the... I don't think he really had the pace, but he should have sort of won that race had he been given the right strategy. He was the lead car, but he wasn't given the best strategy. And in this instance, Leclerc was the lead car, but they didn't give him the best strategy. And I can understand that if you genuinely think you didn't have enough time to pit. And I don't think Ferrari did, but that's just a misjudgment. The amount of time they had when you watch it back is so much that to have ruined Leclerc's race by doing that is just classic Ferrari, isn't it, really? But also, regardless of what the team do for your strategy when you're in the lead of the race, it's also not just through the racing gods, I think, not an advantage always to be first. We've seen it with Norris. In Russia, you just don't have the flexibility on decision-making to make a decision about tyres, so he didn't and ended up falling back and not even being in the points, I don't think, even though he could have been on for his first win. Hamilton, he was first, and again, a decision on tyres. Everyone else pit, but because you're in the lead, you don't want to give it up. So he ended up having that restart on his own. And, both of them ruined their races by doing that and not coming in for the right tyres you need in the conditions. And being the lead car isn't always the best place to win a race. And after the restart in the UK, the race just got unbelievable. It just became absolutely mad. The Ferraris going at it with each other, Perez fighting Hamilton, Alonso and Norris were actually both keeping up with the 4 at the front, helped out by DRS, but even then they had the pace to keep up. That's pretty cool. And then 5 cars from 5 different teams, nose to tail, racing wheel to wheel, every corner taking different lines, going around each other. Hamilton taking 2 cars at once is just some of the best. That bit of commentary, that 5 minutes of those races, I watched it with my dad and my brother, and we're just all sat there just smiling and laughing at the TV. And I've watched it back in the last couple of days, and Crofty and Martin are just doing exactly the same thing. Just, you can tell, you can hear in their commentary how much they're just sort of stepped back from the screens, taking it all in. And at various points, you can hear them remembering they have to commentate on it rather than just laugh at what they're watching. And it's great. It's incredibly reassuring about these cars, and it's incredibly reassuring that it's the British Grand Prix. Another great example of a brilliant cops incident. This time, one where someone didn't end up in the wall. Hamilton's involved. Hamilton goes around the outside of Leclerc in the corner before, which was an unbelievable move in itself. And Leclerc said, "No, I'm not going to let you have that. That was a good move, but I'm going to put one of the moves of the season around the outside of cops." And I mean, every time we cut to that corner now and there's 2 cars trying to overtake, I think everybody, including the commentators, are just waiting for something to go wrong now. It seems the drivers just have absolutely no recollection of history, or if they do, they're absolutely just mad and don't care. But Leclerc pulls it off around the outside. It's an unbelievable move. The bravery is absolutely unbelievable. And and then Hamilton in the press conference or in the post-race interviews really lets himself down sometimes. He's, on many occasions, very logical and sensible when he speaks about things. But on this occasion, he had to have a little dig, didn't he? He had to have a dig about going through cops 2 abreast and not ending up in the wall. And clearly made a dig at Verstappen and about his racing and about Leclerc being a better racer than him. And you only have to look at the stills, at the onboards, and see how much Hamilton's position during that corner changed to know that Hamilton was at fault. And to say, that you got a fucking 10-second penalty and you were deemed at fault by the FIA and by most people that watched it. It's a shame, I think, sometimes that people feel they need to have little digs like that when it's clearly their fault. You hit the apex this time, Lewis. That was what changed, but all right. But, I mean, fair play to Mercedes as a whole. I mean, at various points throughout that race, I was actually convinced that Hamilton could win. There was that stat that in 2009 and in 2013, both seasons where there was a big regulation change, and both seasons where Hamilton didn't have, one of the best cars, well, maybe one of the best cars, but not the top car, he failed to win a race in the first 9 races, but won the 10th. And I thought, fucking hell, the statistics and history is going to completely change the course of this season, and he's going to win this race and go on to win it. And at various points I thought that was actually going to happen. So it's testament to how fast Mercedes are and how much pace they found and how much of a good drive they both put in. Well, but when I say both, I mean Hamilton on his own and George up to the first corner. And finally, when it comes to Silverstone, a big shout out to Mick. He's back on track. He's got his first points. I think every single F1 fan wanted him to get them, and he's finally got them, and he got a race. He got them at a race where he was against Max Verstappen for some of it, which is nice. I thought there were occasions, actually, where Verstappen overstepped the line a little bit, on fair racing. But overall, I think it was okay. I think I was just annoyed that I wanted Verstappen to just let Mick have it just for one race. Just let him double his points, please. But, yeah, overall I think it was really entertaining. And I like the fact that he wasn't content with the points he'd already got. He could have very easily sat back and just accepted the points, but he didn't. He went, I'm gonna get some more here, and I'm going to race a world champion for them. All right. So finally we've seen some Schumacher genes come out of that guy. And I really hope that that's a step up to be more consistent. Haas seem to have stepped it up a bit. They've now, since Austria, got 2 double points finishes, and they seem to have nailed some setup on their car, even though they haven't upgraded it somehow. And Mick and Kevin look really solid, so it's good. I really hope they are actually consistent and step it up, because I think for a while it seemed as if the general vibe was that Mick wasn't living up to the name in many places, and although he's part of that Ferrari driver academy, wasn't really in contention. They've got two very strong drivers, but you'd have thought if Mick can show his worth as a driver, then he's the next Ferrari driver, and that would just be an unbelievably great story, wouldn't it? And I think if Mick has found something now and he can maintain this, then it's really positive for not only him but also Ferrari in the future. And there's such a strong and large amount of teams right now that have an unbelievably brilliant school of drivers that they could call on, and it's going to start calling into question lots of these drivers that maybe are sticking around for their reputation and not for their current performances. Anyway, to bring us up to date, finally, I'm sorry it took so long. I will promise to be more consistent, like Mick, after this. We come on to Austria, where it doesn't seem they have any security in this place, that people can get flares, and that many of them, into the track. Or maybe that's a requirement. Maybe it's, have you got your ID? Have you got your ticket? Did you bring a sun hat? Have you got a flare? Maybe that's just how it works. But I would be so annoyed as a person in the grandstands. You paid for a ticket. You're thinking, I'm at a Grand Prix. Not only am I not going to have to watch it on telly, but I'm going to get the best view in the house right next to the track. And then all of a sudden, you can't see anything but orange a foot in front of your face. I'd be well annoyed. And they've got to be annoying from the point of view of the drivers now, because they ruin your visibility. So all of a sudden, your risk of not getting around the first lap is increased. And, we're lucky on TV that we've got loads of different camera angles so they can sort of get around it. But, yeah, from the perspective of the crowd and the perspective of the drivers, it's got to be frustrating. I can't see it from a safety point of view sticking around for much longer. And, actually, it makes me think that maybe the Brits, if it's a Verstappen and Hamilton never-ending rivalry from now on, as it seems that, the fans at Silverstone booing Verstappen and the fans in the Netherlands and in Austria booing Hamilton seem to be promoting, which I don't condone, by the way. It seems a disappointment that we haven't got some red, white and blue flares going on to completely ruin the visibility of the fans and the drivers on the first lap at Silverstone. As we always have in Austria, it's a carbon copy of the Mercedes versus Red Bull spinning each other out. Turn 4 or 5, I can never remember the numbers. Perez trying to go around the outside, Russell up the inside, Russell getting a 5-second penalty. I think rightly so. I think Perez deserved some room around the outside of that corner, and Russell sort of just understeered into him a bit. And it was the same for when Vettel and Gasly came together. Vettel was even more alongside, even more in front than Perez, so he deserved even more room. But yeah, incidents around that corner I don't think will ever end. Drivers will always think they're the next person to pull off a spectacular move around the outside, and occasionally people do. But I think the way to do it, as Charles Leclerc showed, is to absolutely Verstappen dive bomb on Verstappen up the inside of that corner, and seemingly come from nowhere. And that was another great move from Leclerc, and another one of those moves that you think the reason Leclerc's in the title battle and Sainz maybe isn't is because in the same car I can't see Sainz having done a move like that. And it seems that Leclerc's got a more aggressive driving style than Sainz on occasion, and can just match Verstappen's aggression and even surprise Verstappen in a way that Verstappen was doing to Hamilton last year. But yeah, that corner's hard to go around the outside of, because the person on the inside, it's one of those corners, because it's sort of cambered out in a weird way. The driver on the inside just can't see the driver on the outside and whether they've gone for the move or not until they're either touching them or they've made it. And so we're just going to see that happen so many times, because you go from looking in your mirror on the straight to trying to do the corner to not knowing whether there's a car there to hitting them within half a second. And the visibility of these cars is really not going to help that. And another race, carrying on from Silverstone, where the Hasses and especially Mick had so much pace around Austria. It was unbelievable. Hamilton did not have an answer to them for the majority of the race. Haas and Mick passing Hamilton on pure pace on a couple of occasions. And also Mick, in the sprint race, not being very happy with not being allowed through, even though he was supposedly faster than Magnussen. And I think the world and Formula One has just given Mick a little prod. Got a little stick out and just prodded him slightly. And it's sort of, in a Hulk-like way, awoken a Schumacher anger from within. And now he's not going to take it anymore. And he's going to be consistent and fast. And he's not going to take any shit. And if he thinks he's faster, he's going to do it. And in the main race on the Sunday, he did what you should do, really, which is show that you're faster on track and just overtake. And that's exactly what he did, and it worked out very well for him. Alonso never ceases to amaze, does he, with being able to do hand gestures like that most people would do in their road cars and immediately have a crash out of road rage. He's doing it just before a braking zone at 200 miles an hour. It's impressive, the capacity that these people have. And not to have just immediately locked up and gone straight into the gravel is superhuman. And it's one of those things I might have a try out on the F1 game and see how much I fail every time. But yet again, a race where 5 cars have gone wheel to wheel, going into corners, jostling for position, all fairly equal on pace. And it's very reassuring for the season, it's very reassuring for the cars, it's very reassuring for the drivers, but it's also reassuring for even tracks like Paul Ricard, which in the last few years haven't produced, immaculately entertaining races. I think if 5 cars, and that many cars and teams respectively, can go into corners and down straights fairly equally like that, I think it lends itself to wide tracks. These narrow tracks have produced good racing too, because it means the drivers have to be on it. But at the same time, Paul Ricard has got so many wide corners and corners where you take lots of different lines through it, similar to Silverstone in lots of places. It's going to, I think, produce a really good race at Paul Ricard. I know, having released this a week or so before Paul Ricard, that I'm going to be very quickly shown up for that prediction, but we'll find out. I think it's reassuring stuff for now. Leclerc, it was another race where Leclerc just had an unbelievable amount of pace. It reminded me of Spain, where he should have just been in the distance, not really being troubled by anyone for the entire duration. But what with Sainz's engine failure, every time that little radio message popped up, you sit there going, I'm just preparing my disappointment gene now. I'm just preparing for disappointment yet again from Ferrari, from what should have been an easy 1-2 to a double failure. But he managed to coax a throttle problem, and a throttle problem that they made it seem like it was a technical problem, like it was stuck at 20% and wouldn't go back to zero kind of thing, as if it was a thing that they could have reset as a setting, or that it was a fault. But it seemed to me that afterwards, from Ted's notebook, that Mattia Binotto had made it out like there was just something loose down there in the pedal compartment that was just messing him up, which is a much less interesting and technical problem / solution to have. So I can see why they wouldn't want necessarily them to. It's like, his laces came undone and it got tangled around the throttle. That's why it ruined his throttle. But back to that Seb and Gasly crashing thing, it just seems that Seb can't really get a break. In lots of races where he seems to be doing a good performance, he just can't seem to not have people crash into him. And it is lots of times situations where people have crashed into him and it's clearly their fault and he's done nothing wrong. And there's been some really good footage of him and Alonso battling corner after corner and incredibly fairly. And it is a stark contradiction of the racing we've seen up the front for the past couple of years that has been a bit more contact heavy, let's say. But incidents like that make me think that Gasly is a strange person to be in contention to replace Daniel Ricciardo at McLaren. I don't want to put a too fine a point on it, but it doesn't seem to me that Gasly, especially this year, has the performances to justify that. But we will see, especially when you've got Colton Herta and Pato O'Ward and Oscar Piastri and all those people as well in the mix. One of the things I found interesting about Austria was the comment from Verstappen on the radio about how much traction the Ferraris had out of the slow speed. And I think that's the key to Ferrari's pace this year, technically speaking. The traction that they have out of the slow speed just left Verstappen like a sitting duck out of turns 1 and 3 especially. And that ultimately allowed Leclerc just to, I think, look after their tyres a lot better, but also to, essentially overtake Verstappen 3 times. They were just so confident with that pace and so confident with the car that they could throw whatever strategy they liked at Red Bull and they were confident it would win. It was just such a completely different Ferrari than we're used to seeing. They'd almost adopted Red Bull's strategic confidence and ability in that race, which was both reassuring and unnerving, I think, in equal measure. Leclerc, the day before the race, after the sprint, seemed to know exactly what needed to be done in order to win the race. He was so confident that they would have the measure of them on Sunday that it was unbelievable. Hopefully that's a confidence of, we found something about the car, we've got them, and it's going to be equal Stevens. That isn't the phrase. It's going to be equal sequels until the end of the year. It's become a race of hand gestures, actually, Austria this year, hasn't it? With Fernando Alonso giving Tsunoda the shake of the wrist and the no, and Lando Norris just being a bit more direct at his own steering wheel and just giving it the finger. I think coming out of turn 3 it was, just didn't get very good traction, just a bit annoyed at the car, gives it a finger. I think he also knew that he was on TV at that time. They'd gone to the onboard, and I think he could see the screen of the TV direction, what's on TV right now kind of screen, and just went, yeah, you've just all seen me lose traction and not have very much grip on that corner. Give the car a finger. I like it. The last few races have really made me think how much I feel sorry for Lando having signed that contract for so long, you know. I think I understand his point about having sort of security and stability within a team, and I think we only have to look at Daniel swapping teams so much to know how much of a reassurance it is to make yourself at home in a team, and Lando's certainly done that at McLaren. But if they can't get their act together very soon, then I really do think Lando's wasting himself there, you know. Imagine, you know, when Perez seems too good to get rid of right now, but he can't be around for much longer. He has to retire soon. Maybe not that soon, he's not that old, but he can't be around for that much longer, and Lando would be an unbelievable choice for Red Bull, no? And, you know, Mercedes will be looking at him when Hamilton goes. And so many teams would want him because he's clearly outperformed a car that isn't very good for a while. And it would be a very interesting pairing, wouldn't it? A Russell and Norris, or a Verstappen and Norris. I'm going to be living in my little fantasy world about the parallel universe thing for quite a while on that one. And talking about McLaren, I spoke about it earlier, Ricciardo being back in the points in Austria. And I think, to be honest with you, people are taking too much reassurance from that. It was 9th, and we're talking about Daniel Ricciardo, race winner here. I think people are too quick to say, well, he's back in the points this race, so he will be next race kind of thing, and maybe he's found something. But it's happened with multiple people, and with Daniel, multiple times throughout this year and last, where you go, oh, great, he's back in the points, and he's got a half-good position. He must be about to unlock some performance in the car, and then next race he's back out the points and struggling again. So I think people are too quick to jump on that. But I'm hoping my pessimism isn't realism. I'd love to say that Daniel can start matching Lando and start performing a lot better, and I'm hoping that McLaren can give them both a good car, because it's depressing as a bit of a McLaren fan to see them wallowing so far down the order, and especially when McLaren have got all of the drivers that they have in the pipeline. It would be very interesting, as well as maybe a Lando Russell or a Lando Max, maybe to see a Albon Lando pairing. That'd be cool, wouldn't it? Even though I think Albon is probably in the hunt for Perez replacement when Perez goes. I mean, they've kept him around for a reason, haven't they, Red Bull? And I think the final happy point to end on is how we've got a really tight championship battle, and it's continued to be tight, even with all of the failures and reliability problems that both of the top teams have had in the last 6 races. But it is still very tight at the top, and I think Ferrari's pace in Austria really demonstrates how much tighter it both can be and probably will be over the next few races. We've reached the halfway point. We've still got half of the season left to decide the championship. And not only is it a tight championship battle, but it's one that's being done in good faith, which is nice to see, especially after last year. I love the shot of Verstappen and Leclerc spraying each other with champagne after Austria, and Max just absolutely soaking Leclerc, and them both turning around and just laughing to each other. Sort of like, you know, kids during a heat wave, and they've got the hose pipe out. Obviously not in the UK because of the hosepipe ban, but, you know, the paddling pool comes out. It's just a day of running around in swimming trunks and spraying each other with water pistols and hose pipes. It kind of reminded me of that. They both just turn and laugh at each other like little children who've discovered hose pipes. It's really good, and I like how much the battle is clean this year as opposed to last year. Leclerc and Verstappen seem much more like equals, I suppose, in age and background and growing up together, and in stature as racing drivers, I suppose, as well. There's much less of the old-timer, unbreakable champion of Hamilton versus the new, aggressive fire starter of Verstappen. When you get rid of that dynamic, it's amazing how well-meaning and happy-go-lucky both the title contenders can be. And with that in mind, I think that's the last 6 races of Formula 1 recapped. It's been a very long one, so thank you for sticking around, and thank you for waiting for the amount of time that you have for me to recap them. Hopefully next time I won't be sat in my car roasting my absolute arse off. It's been lovely, this heat wave, but as I've said, I don't cope with it very well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening. This has been F1 More Thing. We'll see you next time.